Although it wasn't the world's first, it is undoubtedly the world's first successful semi-automatic battle rifle, declared by no less than General George S. Patton to be the greatest battle implement ever devised. Today, a short and convoluted history of America's M1 Garand.
I'm speaking to you from this United States Army located at Springfield, Massachusetts.
Redneck Preppy with you, and today a short and convoluted history of the U.S. rifle caliber 30 M1, better known to most people as the M1 Garand, arguably America's most iconic battle rifle. As with previous entries in the short and convoluted series, this video is meant as an introduction to the history of the M1 Garand, not an exhaustive look.
We come from every quarter, from the north, south, east, and west, to clear the way to freedom for the land we love the best.
We're going to begin this story by going back in time. Although we tend to look at the earliest 20th century as the exclusive domain of bolt-action service rifles, the reality is that there was a great interest in providing semi and even fully automatic rifles as standard issue weapons. The most famous example, though it didn't really see much combat use, was the First World War's Fedorov Automat, designed by Vladimir Grigorievich Fedorov in 1915, the world's first fully automatic rifle, though there are some who would argue that it was actually a light machine gun. Only a few thousand were produced, and the Russians, and later Soviets, ended up sticking with the Mosin-Nagant rifle until another, more successful attempt at a semi-automatic rifle a few decades later. The world's first introduction of a semi-automatic battle rifle was in fact in Mexico, when that country issued the technological marvel known as the M1908 Mondragon rifle, designed by General Manuel Mondragon, to some troops during the Mexican Revolution in 1911. It should be noted that that rifle, for various reasons but mainly due to high unit price, was never actually widely issued, as only 400 were delivered by SIG before the contract was cancelled. Interestingly, the German Air Force bought the other rifles that the company didn't get a chance to deliver to Mexico and used them on their airplanes during the First World War until they were replaced by fully automatic machine guns. Other countries, including France, did experiment with semi-automatic rifles, but ultimately none of them managed to stick to become a universally adopted rifle.
Heavily laden with time-expired men, bound for the land they adore.
Now let's go back in time even further to January the 1st, 1888. On that day in Saint-Lamy, Quebec, Canada, John Cantius Garand was born. It is a town today of about 9,000 inhabitants, nearly universally French-speaking, and one seemingly unaware of Garand's birth there, at least judging by its official website. To address the question of pronunciation, Garand publicly stated that his name rhymed with errand, which is why I pronounce it that way. The U.S. military, however, decided his name should be pronounced Garand, and that's how his son pronounced it. Other people pronounce it Garand. Finally, in a video that I released a few years ago, I posited that because he was born in Quebec, where French is the dominant language, that his name was probably actually originally pronounced Garand, before the family anglicized its pronunciation. And they would have done that because about 10 years after his birth, the Garands moved to Connecticut, and very quickly he began on the path that would eventually land him at Springfield Armory. In his early years, Garand held some jobs at a textile mill and tool-making factory. He was also interested in the shooting sports and When combined with his growing skill in invention, it perhaps naturally led him on the path of becoming a firearms designer. After a few stops, which included the Federal Screw Corp in Providence, Garand found himself in New York City, where he worked on issues involving automatic gun mechanisms. That caught the eye of the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Invention, and they convinced him to join the National Bureau of Standards to continue his work. Additionally, Garand was working on a design for a light machine gun, but unfortunately work wasn't completed on that until after the First World War. But Garand's obvious genius was noticed by the United States government, and they offered him a position in 1919 as an engineer with Springfield Armory, then America's primary weapons designer and manufacturer. Now, prior to joining Springfield, most of his work involved machine guns, but it was here that he switched his efforts to semi-automatic rifles.
For the girl who loves a soldier is the girl who adores a parade.
Not long after Garand joined Springfield, the Ordnance Department announced in 1921 that it was entertaining proposals for a new semi-automatic weapon to replace the much-loved but aging M1903 Springfield. The requirements were as follows. 1. It must be of the self-loading type, adapted to function with the service cartridge. 2. The weight must not exceed 9 pounds. 3. It must be well balanced and adapted to shoulder fire. 4. It must be simple, strong, and compact, and adapted to ease of manufacture. 5. It must be so designed that the magazine can be fed from clips or chargers. 6. It must be entirely semi-automatic, i.e. so designed that it is impossible to fire more than one shot with each squeeze of the trigger. 7. The mechanism must be so designed as to preclude the possibility of premature unlocking. Preferably, the bolt should be positively locked at the instant of firing. 8. The use of special oil or grease or other material applied to the cartridge should not be necessary to the proper functioning of the rifle. Well, as you can imagine, particularly when it comes to government programs, there is rarely a straight line from the beginning to the end. America's military had been experimenting with semi-automatics, but up until 1924, every rifle that had been tested failed for one reason or another. Garand came up with a design that featured a gas-operated system pushing on an operating rod, or op rod as it's commonly known, that actioned the bolt before it was all returned with a recoil spring. In accordance with the Ordnance Department's requirements of a magazine-fed rifle, Garand also utilized the N-block clip, which was used to insert rounds into the rifle's magazine. Unlike what a lot of people think, Garand didn't invent the idea of an N-block clip. The credit for that goes to Ferdinand Mannlicher, who created it for use in his rifles. Also, several other rifles had used M-block clips before, including the aforementioned Mondragon rifle of Mexico, and even a prior American rifle, the M1895 Lee Navy. The basic idea of the rifle was coming along, but there were a lot of cooks in the kitchen since the rifle was intended to be issued to serving members of every branch. Not surprisingly, different branches had different demands or requirements for their rifle. Garand was also told, remarkably, that he should make use of as many M1903 Springfield parts as possible, mostly to use existing manufacturing equipment and processes to keep tooling costs down. Complicating matters even further, 2 years after it issued its proposal for the new rifle, which you will remember had the requirement of using a .30 caliber cartridge, the Ordnance Department then introduced the new round, the .276 Pedersen, for testing. In 1927, Garand was asked to develop the rifle around the new cartridge, before being forced to abandon that path after no less than Douglas MacArthur, then the Chief of Staff, decided to stick with the .30 caliber round that the military had millions of in inventory. Now, I won't get into the .276 caliber rifle project, but one interesting avenue that Garand did explore was a primer-activated cycling operation. Now, if you want to go down that rabbit hole, there are some interesting articles on the web about it, and I've linked to a Forgotten Weapons video about that in the description below. At any rate, Garand's initial prototype rifle was dubbed the T1E2, and although it was designed in 1926, it wasn't built and tested until 1930 because of the .276 Pedersen thing and other sidelines that he was forced to go down. There was another prototype built the following year which failed due to a faulty bolt, causing a redesign before the design was essentially finalized in 1933 and accepted as the U.S. semi-automatic caliber .30 rifle M1. Over the next few years, the rifle was tested and further refined until January the 9th, 1936, when it was accepted into service, and in 1937, the go-ahead was given to start procuring the rifle for the United States military. Now, one would think excitement over this rifle would have the M1 Garand flying off the production floor into the eager hands of American soldiers. Well, one would think of that, but the reality was quite a bit different. Production was to be charitable glacial. In September 1939, the kickoff of the European side of World War II, Springfield was producing just 100 rifles a day. Even in December 1941, when the United States entered the war, the Armory was still only producing about 600 rifles each day. Part of that had to do with the gas system that the rifle was initially approved with. Problems with it caused the redesign in 1939, which simplified the design and made it more reliable, but obviously delayed production. No knock on Springfield, but given that the rifle was intended for universal issuance, even the 4,000 rifles a day that it would eventually ramp up to wasn't enough. So obviously production was farmed out to other manufacturers as well. Along with Springfield, eventually 5.4 million of the rifles were manufactured by companies like Winchester, International Harvester, and Harrington and Richardson. The rifles initially cost about $200 each to manufacture, or about $3,500 in today's money, before eventually selling down to about $85 a unit, or $1,200 today, though I have found a lower quoted per rifle cost later in the war. It's kind of hard to nail that one down. At this point, you might be thinking that the design of the M1 Garand was locked in and nothing else changed. Well, for the most part, you'd be right, but there was some very slight modification in the rifle and refinement that continued. Some pretty esoteric stuff that experts would likely be interested in. We're talking about things like changes in the formulation of the steel used to make receivers, or manufacturing changes to make it easier to produce, or the rifle slightly more reliable. Now, there was one change that was noticeable, and it was in the first half of 1942 with the addition of a lock bar on the windage nut at the rear of the rifle. It was meant to lock the windage and elevation knobs to stop them from moving due to recoil and user error.
What will their tidings be? The victory roll, the victory roll.
Earlier I mentioned that the path of the M1 Garand took from design to acceptance was a rather circuitous one, but even after the rifle was slowly getting into the hands of American soldiers, there were efforts by some to get rid of it. The most notable was the M1941 Johnson, which was designed by the criminally underappreciated Melvin Maynard Johnson. Johnson was born in 1909 in Boston and was a Marine Corps Reserve officer, graduate of Harvard Law School, and a designer of firearms. When the Garand won the competition to become America's new rifle, Johnson wasn't particularly impressed by it. He believed that the rifle was likely due to be unreliable because of ammunition consistency and the rifle's gas operating system. Now, in hindsight, we know he was wrong about that. With the Garand rolling off Springfield Armory production lines, Johnson attempted to convince military brass that they needed to make a switch right away. The United States Army actually did test the Johnson rifle, but came to the conclusion that the Garand was still the superior rifle. That, and they just spent a boatload of money tooling up and producing thousands of the thing already. Now, I won't get into the Johnson rifle story any further, but it did see some limited use by his beloved Marine Corps in the Pacific Theater. It's an interesting tale, and I would encourage you to look into it if you're interested. As for Johnson, well, his patents were later used in designs of rifles that you might have heard of, the AR-10, AR-15, and M16 rifles by Armalite, who ended up hiring him as a consultant. He was a really impressive man, and definitely not a failed engineer or a one or two trick pony.
Wish me luck as you wave me goodbye. Cheerio, here I go on my way.
There were some experiments and modifications of the M1 Garand that occurred during the Second World War. We're all familiar with the Soviet Union trying, and largely failing, to turn its SVT-40 semi-automatic rifle into a sniper rifle. Well, the United States did the same thing with the M1 Garand, but actually succeeded, creating a sniper variant known as the M1C, which replaced the venerable M1903A4 Springfield in June 1944, and the M1D, which is essentially an M1C but with a simpler scope mount. Although they were both accepted into service in 1944, neither really saw a lot of use during the Second World War. Of course, World War II wasn't the end of service for the M1 Garand. It saw duty again as the standard issue rifle for American soldiers during the Korean War, and though it was replaced in 1957 by the ill-fated M14 rifle, the Garand still saw some use in Vietnam up until about 1965. America, however, wasn't the only user of the Garand, as many other countries adopted it following the Second World War, thanks to U.S. sales or aid. Some of those included Argentina, Chile, Ethiopia, Japan, Laos, Pakistan, Uruguay, and Thailand, among many others. The last military to use them in active service was Haiti until 1994. Several countries, including Greece, still employ them as ceremonial firearms. Returning back to John Garand, one would think that he made out like a bandit, just like John Browning did earlier with the adoption of his rifles and firearms in the millions. Truth is, he gladly signed over all his patents for the Garand to the United States government. Outside of 2 medals, Garand only ever received his usual Springfield Armory salary. Ultimately, he retired in 1953 and passed away in 1974 in Springfield, Massachusetts.
Shouting, praise the Lord, and pass the ammunition. Praise the Lord, and pass the ammunition.
There has long been a belief maintained by American soldiers who had served in World War II or Korea that the sound of an ejecting en-bloc clip would alert the enemy that a soldier had emptied his magazine. They would then be able to rush his position and attempt to kill them. I've also heard stories that American soldiers would toss empty clips on the ground in an attempt to lure the enemy out. Because of that, there actually was some work in attempting to produce plastic en-bloc clips. In the end, though, they stuck with the initially designed spring steel version. Was there, however, any truth to this, that enemy soldiers were drawn to the sound of ejecting clips? I know that there are fervent partisans for these accounts, but I've never been able to come across any verifiable first-hand stories from American soldiers, and most importantly, I haven't found anything from Japanese, German, or Korean sources stating that this was actually a tactic that they employed. I think this is one of those assumed obvious truths that soldiers accepted as gospel based purely on they had a friend whose friend's friend was lit up by a Japanese soldier because of that clip ejecting. And regardless of how long you traveled down the 6 degrees of separation towards the origin of that story, you'd never get to the actual soldier. At any rate, Bloke on the Range did an interesting video about this some years back, and there is a link to that video in the description below. So what was the practical value of fielding during World War II a semi-automatic weapon with an 8-round capacity against an enemy who was typically answering with a bolt-action rifle with a 5-round capacity? Well, here's where I state the obvious. American soldiers had an enormous battlefield advantage against their foes thanks to rapid and sustained firepower. And as for the rifle's legacy, well, if there was any belief during World War II that a bolt-action rifle was still a viable choice for the infantry, the Garand destroyed that. Though in truth, I think you would have been actually hard-pressed to find anyone who would have made that argument. Although many people believe, for example, that Britain remained married to its Lee Enfields unto death, even they experimented with semi-automatics before the war, but stuck with their bolt action only because they didn't have the ability to switch rifles during the war. Germany is associated with the Kar 98K, but there were plenty in that army who were itching for self-loading rifles, hence the military's covert moves to advance the Sturmgewehr against Hitler's wishes. And we know that Stalin desperately wanted his own version of the Garand. Yes, there were some major combatants like Japan and Italy that didn't make any real moves to a semi-automatic rifle, but one could argue that was largely a result of a lack of manufacturing capacity, economics, and raw materials. Perhaps the Garand's real legacy is that it was first to the table, proving to the last naysayers that the average infantryman didn't need to be babysat with a magazine cutoff and a bolt action to avoid blowing through a magazine at the mere sight of an enemy. It showed that sustained fire didn't just belong to machine gun crews, but to every soldier on the battlefield. It wasn't an assault rifle, not like the STG-44 and later AK-47 were, but it changed battlefield tactics for both those wielding it and those facing it. And contrary to what is commonly held, you can't blame Garand or his rifle for the United States rifle caliber 7.62mm M14. That rifle was largely the design of Earl Harvey and Lloyd Corbett. Not a bad legacy for a boy born in a small Quebec town. Oh, and for you Yanks who are wedded to the idea that Garand was an American through and through via immigration, he married a good French-Canadian girl in 1930. He knew where his heart still was. At any rate, I hope you found today's video to be at least vaguely entertaining and mildly informative. I hope you enjoy this brief look at the M1 Garand and its history. Take care, and bye-bye.